Hello and welcome to the Wednesday broadcast of Strategic Speaking for Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and I'm joined again by the amazing Erin Thomas, who is a writer and a content strategist. And we have been talking about how do you move from being an author to speaking, writing articles. And I interviewed Erin last time on how to take your speech and turn it into an article. Now, today we're going to talk about how do you take your article and turn it into a script. So Erin, you're going to be the interviewer this time. Let's go ahead.
Okay, let's see. So a lot of times what happens when I get to clients that they've written something, but they're comfortable writing, but the idea of getting in front of a live audience is very scary and they find themselves hiding behind their computers, or they might be resisting the idea. They think they want to give a speech, but for whatever reason, they're telling themselves that they can't, or that they're just the writer. They're also worried that maybe they're going to bore their audience. Maybe that they're just meant to be writers, and taking it out of behind the computer, why would anyone pay attention?
Right. So for today, we want to talk about how you take your article and make it a compelling speech, because an article is only seen by the people who actually open that screen on the computer or subscribe to that publication. It's only opened by someone who's going to take the time to read it. When you do it as a speech, you have a much wider reach. You can reach so many more people. For instance, you can do a targeted audience because it's someone who's been invited to hear you speaking, or you can publish it on social media to people who are already following you or who are interested in your topic. So if you're not using as many mediums as possible, you're leaving money on the table. And you're also not reaching the people who really need you, who need to know about you. Last time we spoke about, just a quick review, imagine that you are Maria. You're an estate lawyer. You help people with their wills and their trusts. And you've written a great article. You love the way it's written. It works. And people who are reading it pick it up and they reach out to you. Or imagine that you've been speaking and the people you're speaking to are interested, excited, and they come up afterwards and say, let's set up a conversation. If you are Maria, if you've got a great article and a great speech, then you can really use that to generate leads and also to help the people who need to know. It's important to get your estate in order. But what if it's reversed? Erin, I think you could talk a little bit about what happens there.
I can, and I think we've all been in both of these positions. We've been to presentations that are long-winded and they don't hold our attention. They feel all over the place. We've read articles that aren't well organized. They get long-winded and chatty, and we don't arrive to the end, if we make it to the end.
Yeah,
knowing what to do, or if we even want to.
Right.
So we've lost all our impact, right?
So today we are going to talk about how do you take that article and turn it into a compelling speech. And if you're interested about how to take your speech and turn it into a fabulous article, we'll be posting the link to part 1 of this webinar once this is published.
Awesome. I was just going to say, this is a good time for me to introduce you, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth Bachman is the go-to person for advanced level training in speaking, presentation skills, sales, and leadership. With a lifetime spent perfecting the art of presenting, she helps high-level clients master a message that brings the funding they need, the allies they want, and the recognition they deserve. a sought-after speaker and strategist in Silicon Valley, as well as nationally and internationally. Elizabeth works with leaders and influencers who need to become concise and compelling presenters. She helps them present as smart, down-to-earth, loose, friendly, and even funny sometimes, still being taken seriously. In more than 50 operas around the world, Elizabeth has directed such luminaries as Luciano Pavarotti and Placido Domingo, giving her a wealth of tools to help business professionals become respected presenters. Fluent in 5 languages, she is adept at working with presenters from many countries, bringing her global experience to her clients. Strategic speaking for results when you want to make a difference and not just a point. Elizabeth.
Thank you. It's always interesting to hear your own bio being read.
I know it. But here's the takeaway from that is that you are an expert in presentation skills. And let's say that I'm Maria, the estate lawyer we were just talking about. How can I convert my article into a speech? Help me do that.
So I like to think of it as breaking down into 3 categories. You've got strategy, script, and style, delivery style. And delivery style is the big difference. That's something that I will get to in a minute. But the thing about strategy, it's the same for a speech as for an article. You want to know, who are you writing for? Who's your audience? Who's your listener? And make it about them. I like to use a technique I call strategic empathy, which is when you put yourself in the shoes of your listeners and say, what is it that they want? What made them show up to this speech? What made them register for this webinar? What do they care about more than what you care about?
That's the number 1 rule in writing an article as well. It's all about the audience, not about you.
Exactly, which is a good thing, actually. That's if you make it about the audience, give people what they want. And to a certain extent, this is marketing basic lesson 1 in marketing. What do people care about?
Absolutely.
The script.
I was going to say, let's move on to script before we dive into style.
Yeah. So the script are the words that you use. You've got much more opportunity to be conversational in a speech. I believe in writing out everything so that you know more or less what you want to say, but then you can improvise. You can take it off the cuff, if you will. And then delivery style is how you show up. That's why I call myself a presentation skills trainer rather than a speaker trainer, because it's so much more than just giving a speech. It's how do you show up in the office, at your organization. Most of my clients are high-level women in tech and law. So how do they show up with their clients, with their colleagues? Presentation, how you present yourself, is the key.
Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about the script and the structure that we would get to. This is what Erin gave us last time, and it's very similar. You want an introduction with a hook. Now, your hook that's a marketing term for catching their attention. You want to come out and start strong. You don't want to say, now I wanted to tell you about. You want to say, imagine you're Maria, and you have to turn your article into a speech, something that would get their attention. In other words,
you just start. You don't say, I'm going to tell you about, you just start telling.
Exactly.
Right out of the gate.
Exactly. A quote, a story. There are lots and lots of ways that you can get people's attention. Also, in the introduction, you need to tell them a little bit about yourself to prove that you are worth listening to, that you know that. That's what the bio slide is for. And then you've got your talking points, A, B, and C. So the 3 talking points. And then you have your conclusion. It's important to make sure that each talking point is clear and that you have a clear transition from A to B to C. And then in the conclusion, you're going to have your call to action. What do you want them to do with this information? If you're making a presentation inside your organization and you're talking to your team, maybe the call to action is to get them excited to do what you want them to do. Or maybe it's to tell upper management, to have upper management excited to sponsor the new initiative you want to propose. If you're doing a public service speech or speaking to the public, it might be to have them hire you. It might be to have them fund your nonprofit, or might be to go out and do something with this information. Maria, for instance, the lawyer, she wants them to set up their wills or revise their wills and trusts, whether they do it with her or not.
An article is very similar to what we talked about. At the end of the article, readers need to know that it's over, but they need to know what you want them to do now that they've read. Yes. So it sounds like a speech is very much the same.
Here's the key, though. Start with the conclusion and reverse engineer it. It's as if you want to know where you're going. The reason for the outline is to give you a structure to follow and to know where you're going to end. One thing about the timing is that most of the time, if you're giving a speech, you're timed. You have to do it within a certain amount. And if you run over time, they'll turn you off. They'll stop you. So make sure that you always leave time for your call to action. One extra little insider tip is if you're thinking about how do you organize your tips, there are many directions to do it. The talking points. Talking point C should be, I should do a number 3 here. Talking point C should be the most powerful, the most impactful, the one that gets people excited, because that's leading into the call to action. A would be the one that gets their attention. B, the middle one, is important, but make sure that you could do it in 1 or 2 sentences if you needed to. That's your safety space. You can compress it if you need to, or expand it if you need to. Because if you're speaking live, you never know if, say, the person before you has run over time, or they're running late, or suddenly they're bringing if you do it at lunches, I've spoken at a lot of lunches, if you're speaking at a lunch and suddenly they're bringing in a really loud dessert, you don't want that to cover your conclusion. So that is kind of a safety thing. And that's something that one of my that actually I learned when putting together concerts, the beginning, the ending, and then a little wiggle space in between.
I like that. I never knew that. And I think it makes so much sense. And an easy one to implement.
It's an easy one to implement. Yes. It helps when you have to think on your feet. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So we've gone through structure and we talked about this a little bit in part 1. So when we write an article, and we've got a lot of similarities between the way we've kind of seen that there's a lot of similarities between the way the article and a speech is set up, but we're getting ready to really get into the differences. But what I'm thinking is the same analogy that we used in part 1 applies here. A basic speech without any spice is the equivalent of serving boiled noodles with a can of tomatoes dumped on top. It's edible, but it's kind of boring and we don't really want it, right?
And if this is your business, say you're running an Italian restaurant, that is not going to get you customers.
For sure.
So what you really want to do is spice it up. That would be the same with stories, anecdotes, and ways of enhancing the basic structure. You do want the outline first. And I know, Erin, you said that you weren't so happy about having an outline when you're speaking. You could do it when you're writing, but you have a hard time when you're speaking. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's something that I guess it makes a lot of sense when I'm doing an article, and I guess it's more natural to approach it that way. But sometimes it can feel a little bit limiting when I'm speaking, like it bottlenecks the creative energy. Maybe. Do you ever get that pushback from clients?
I get that pushback a lot, especially from very creative people. The key to having an outline is it's a structure that tells you where you want to go. It's like the flight plan for a plane. You need to know where you're headed. But then I like to think of it like jazz. So I've spent 30 years in the music business. So in jazz, you have a defined beginning. Everybody knows when it starts. You have a defined ending. You've got to tell people when it's done so that they know when to applaud. And you have a tune to follow. But within that, you can improvise. You're free to add things. This is the same with the spicing up. You would have a basic recipe of noodles and some tomatoes, but then what you add to it is what makes it interesting and what makes it yours, different from everybody else. So that would be strategy and script.
Yeah. Let's dive into the meat. I know that style is really, delivery is what truly sets us apart. Writing and spoken communication, it's all about the delivery.
It's how you are perceived, how you show up and how you are perceived, which is partly the words. You've got to have the words first before you deliver them, or at least you have that outline first before you deliver them. But then how you deliver the words is what sets the great speakers apart from the wannabes or the boring ones, the ones like you were talking about, the ones who are worried that they will bore their audience.
Exactly.
There's so much to talk about here. I'm just going to focus on a couple of the key challenges that I see, especially when someone has written the article and are now turning it into a speech. I tend to work with really smart people who know a whole lot about something complicated. So the art of turning that into a speech is an art, actually.
Well, and I'm sure that you've probably experienced with these smart, really involved professionals, they can write a lot and use a lot of the words they're familiar with, but they would freeze when they get on a stage, or really have that worry like, I'm not going to hold anybody's attention the way I'm talking about this now.
And if you start your webinar or your speech thinking that, the audience will notice. One of the key differences between an article and a speech is taking into account the learning styles of the audience. You have people who are visual, there's visual learners, and that is actually a large percentage of human beings, but not everybody. There are people who learn best. They're the ones for whom the slides are important, and they're the ones who respond best to videos, for instance. There are the auditory learners. Those are the people who learn it best when they hear it and then say it back. For instance, I'm an auditory learner. I will listen to a podcast before I will watch a video. Actually, you probably have to chain me to the chair to get me to sit down and learn something from a video. I'm much happier if I can read it. And then there are the kinesthetic learners, who are the people who feel it in their gut. They sense things, and they learn best by actually doing something. As for a speaker, one of the things that you can really do, that you would help with, is for the auditory learners, make sure that they say something out loud. If you've got a great phrase, like when you want to make a difference, not just a point, you could say that after me. So Erin, say that after me. When you want to make a difference, not just a point.
when you want to make a difference, not just a point.
And see how that feels to say that out loud. And those of you who are listening, please do that. For the kinesthetic learners, getting them to write is good. Most of the time we're on webinars these days, this is why you want people to enter information into the chat. The tricky part with webinars is there are so many other distractions. It's hard to just focus on the webinar and not be playing solitaire or answering your emails at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah. I have one of the early times that I learned this, one of my very early clients was Brooke, who still is a website designer. And she came to me because she had a speech that she wanted to do, and she was trying to get people to hire her to do their websites. And she had a 15 to 20 minute speech with 52 slides. Ooh. And it was all the different cool design things that they could do. Well, of course, she's a graphic artist and a website designer. She's a visual learner. But she wasn't getting the engagement. When she did this for the groups that she was speaking to, people would be overwhelmed. Too much information to process. So we went through and we added things that people could say. We added things for people, sayings that people could repeat for the auditory learners. And we added things for the kinesthetic learners to write, and ways that they could move their bodies. When she did that, when I finally persuaded her to cut the 52 slides down to about 20, she reported that she was getting 4 or 5 clients every time she gave that speech.
Wow.
Out of, say, 50 to 100 people, 4 or 5 of them would sign up.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's great.
So
let me ask you a question too. I have a lot of clients that come with a lot of graphs and info charts and that kind of thing rather than images. Can those be used on slides?
Very sparingly. If you think about an article, maybe in an academic article, you're required to have graphs and charts and such, but they're not very interesting. If it's an article for the public, you're going to have images in there, and you're going to have colored images in there. The best thing to do is to have clear, simple images. Now, here's another thing to remember is that nowadays, when you're doing a virtual presentation, a lot of people are going to be listening on their phones and watching on their phones. So it's got to fit on that small screen.
And be legible. So you're not squinting, trying to read the numbers or that makes a lot of sense. It's much better to have a visual that is colorful and very easy to see, I'm sure.
Yeah, I actually was in a class yesterday with the graphic artist who helps me. Her name is Bridget Callahan of Babylon Arts, and she has made these slides much more interesting than the first one I cobbled together. Erin saw the horrible paste up I had first.
No, they weren't horrible, but I was so amazed at her genius. It was great.
It was great. But the thing about the class was she was showing what she was seeing on her giant monitor. I know that in her office, she has one of these huge flat screen TVs. And on my laptop, it was hard. I was coming in very close to try to see what she was doing. It made sense for her. It was fine, but I'm going to have to watch the recording before I know exactly what happened. So there was an example just happened yesterday.
Perfect. Let me ask you another question.
Yes.
Since we're talking about people consuming on their phones, with so many distractions like what we're talking about here, how do we keep people from clicking away when we're speaking? How do we keep them from zoning out and multitasking and playing solitaire, like you mentioned?
Yes. Well, you want to ask them, if you're doing it live, you want to ask them to write something into the chat. If they're watching the recording, there's nothing you can do about it. But what you can do is you can say, pause the recording and write this down. Also, writing is a learning technique. We understand better if we write it down by hand. It's just to get that hand-eye muscle memory going. And this is also very helpful if you're doing it live. Use a handout. Have people for things to write down while they're doing it. I know many people take notes on their phones, but if you can get them to put the phones down, that's a really good thing. It's too tempting.
Well, and how about a little bit on the, assuming they're watching and maybe it's not live, how do you keep them engaged with just your presence? What are some tips and tricks people can use from a delivery standpoint?
Well, let's get to the main thing that people get in trouble with is what they call the Geschwindigkeitsbegrenzungsschwelle. That's my way to stop myself from that.
Oh my, okay.
Can you read that one out loud?
No, I cannot. I'm not even going to try, but you deserve an award.
So I did that one for you, Erin, because I know you're based in Germany. It is the German word for a speed bump.
I just learned something new. Thank you.
Well, I think that probably the Germans say speed bump. Das ist ein Speedbump, but the technical word is Geschwindigkeitsbegrenzungsstelle, which you can get some leverage with that. The challenge that happens, especially if you have written this before, is when you're nervous, to run things through, to rather than you talk very fast and you never make any stops and you never breathe and you never parse for paragraphs. When you're writing, you automatically will make a paragraph return. You put in a period. We don't think about that, but actually that punctuation is there for a reason. The other thing about speed bumps, and where I first learned this, was I ran an opera company. I founded and ran an international opera organization. And I learned the art of public speaking because I had to do fundraising speeches. I had to raise $100,000, mostly in $100 increments, all through speaking. And one of the times I did that, my assistant said afterwards, do you realize that you did that entire speech without ever smiling? And I thought, why didn't she tell me? So what I do is I will put a little sun, a little icon of a sun, or sometimes the tilde that goes above the N in Spanish, like for cañón, for instance, that also kind of looks like a wind, will remind me to breathe. If you put it on your slides, then you don't want to put a happy face because then it's obvious that that's like, remember to smile, Elizabeth, but go through there and you just put a little icon in there in the corner. It looks like a decoration, but it's for you to remember to breathe.
I love that. And it's so, again, so simple and something we can all do immediately as a reminder.
Yes.
I love it. What else can we do?
The other thing I like is honor the space between. Here again, and this was actually the beginning of this conversation between the two of us, is when you use the subheadings for an article, those are like the title of each talking point. That is a place that signals that you've finished one thought and you're going to start a new one. You need to do that with speaking. If you would have a paragraph, then pause before you start the next thought when you're speaking. Pay attention to where there is white space and practice the pause. One of the great phrases in the speaking business is the power of the pause. Often people use that for think. Yep. That silence makes a difference. But also, I believe it is The pause at the end of a sentence, at the end of a thing, where you would pause to breathe in and think something new. Pay attention to that. One of the speed bumps that you can do, if this were a solo webinar and I was just recording this, I would put in title slides where there would be a subheading in an article. Just put the title slide in there. It will remind me to stop.
It's a gift to your listeners and to your readers, because you
Yes.
let them know, like a subtitle for me will let someone know that article or that paragraph has ended. We're going on to something else. By incorporating this into your speech, you're allowing the audience to stop for a minute, process, and know that you're starting something else. I really like that, and I think it's important.
Well, the other thing is, you know your material, but they don't.
Yes.
And
if they're just
especially
going through it, no one knows where you're headed.
especially nowadays when we're having a very international world. The world of business is very international these days. Chances are a lot of the people that you're talking to, if you're speaking English, that's their second or third language. It might be your second or third language. You're living in Germany right now. If you have to give a speech auf Deutsch,
Yep.
that's a challenge. I had to do that. My opera company was located in Austria. So I had to do speeches in German a lot. And I had to really work to get that, to slow down, to make sure that the information came out clearly.
How do you prevent it from coming out monotone? How do you prevent it from being very like a constant level 5 and no one's having any emotion? And how do you,
Yes.
maybe if someone's not naturally extroverted and energetic, how do you work through that?
One of the things I love to do is use stories and metaphors. And the thing is, when you tell a story, for instance, the story of Brooke, the web designer, or the story of Maria, the estate lawyer, that is, your voice will naturally change when you're telling a story as opposed to giving the instructions. Most of the times it comes from nerves. So work in the pauses, stories and metaphors. And here's the other part. Practice and polish your stories. Stories, I like to think of them as nuggets that you're dropping in.
Kind of like the almonds in a chocolate bar.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we started out with pasta. Now we're in chocolate bars. That's a good, I like that idea.
It's almost dinner time here in Germany, so I have an excuse.
Yes, exactly. You're not going to do just stories. It is to illustrate your point, but you want it to be concise and polished. The worst thing to do is to start a story and you kind of ramble on, and we've all sat through that, right? And especially
that's a plus. I think articles, you realize you're doing it and you have time to tighten it up. When you realize I've written this long, but speeches, I can see how that would be. And another thing, and another thing.
It's really easy to go off on tangents. So as a speaker, that's another reason for starting at the end and then reverse engineering. If you can, as a speaker, if you can have a countdown timer, if you're doing it live, you have someone in the front row who's just going to say 15 minutes, 10 minutes, so that you know how long it's going to take to do your call to action. That helps a lot, so that you know where you need to get into the end part, where you need to get into your conclusion. Practicing, and here's the other thing, practice out loud. One of the things that happens all the time with clients who come to me and they've written a fabulous article, and perhaps they're an expert in some sort of scientific something, and they have to give a speech in English. They're nervous. If they're nervous, then you tend to go into a monotone. I make them practice out loud because a word that makes sense when you read it might not make sense when you hear it. There again, if your audience is not necessarily fluent in English, they have to think. So think about words that have consonants, words that are easier to say, simpler words. When I'm speaking to an audience in Austria or Germany, most of what I do is with German-speaking countries, my international clients, I deliberately choose simple words, words that an American audience would understand because they know the context. I will use a simpler word or a simpler phrase, might not be as elegant on the page, but it's going to be easier to hear.
That makes total sense. What I'm feeling is that there's so much that goes into creating a speech, right? And what a gift you have being able to really help people dial this in. If we could take away only one thing from today, what would it be?
Well, the key takeaways, I'll give you 3 of them.
Okay.
Think about beginnings and endings. Make sure you have a strong, polished beginning with a hook, and that you have a strong, polished ending. Well, another thing that people will do is they will say their final thing, and then they kind of keep on talking, whatever. End it, because we want to know when to applaud. You want to know when it's over, and you need that satisfaction of tying it up.
Yeah.
So
and the impact for you as the presenter, you need that moment too, where it's very clear and concise what you just delivered and what you want them to do.
And people will forgive a little improvisation in the middle. They'll remember the beginning, they'll remember the end.
Good point.
So, which takes me to the next part, which is memorize that strong beginning and memorize the ending, especially if this is a presentation where you want people to enroll people to buy in to what you want them to do, especially if there's money involved. You want to practice it so that even if you're nervous, your mouth will keep going. If you've told the story, if you can start the story and you can keep going. Speaking is a physical act. You have to train your lips and tongue to pronounce the words. So memorize the beginning and memorize the ending, just in case you're nervous. And then one of the things that I don't hear other people talk, I don't hear other trainers talk about, is have a final thought, a final saying, like a tagline that you can say at the very end, especially say you're being interviewed on a webinar, then you can say, I'd like to leave you with one thing. After the host has said da, 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 tell them in advance you're going to do this. The host has said, thank you for coming. And then you say, I leave you with one thought. It's like the punchline for a joke. Might not be funny, but that will be the thing that they walk away with that they'll remember.
Oh, I really like that. That makes so much sense. I love it. So tell us your final thought.
Actually, I'm going to wait till the very end because I want to go on to say, this has been from page to stage and from stage to page back again. If you're interested in learning more, you can see on the screen, we have Erin Thomas at erinthomascommunications.com. And I'm Elizabeth Bachman at elizabethbachman.com. You can reach us on the social media. This is being created for social media, so we'll put links to everybody's information in the comments and links to part 1 of this webinar. And with that, I'm going to stop the share and turn back into the host of the Strategic Speaking for Results broadcast to say thank you for coming. And here's the final thought. Anytime you are speaking to move people to take action, It's a form of sales. And sales is like sex. Nothing happens until people get excited.
Ooh, so true.